Hey there, this is Jay Frost speaking to you, of course, from the world headquarters of the Philanthropy Mastermind series, my house. And I'm really happy to welcome you back to another in this series. If you are coming to us fresh from AFP, the nearly 3,000 member meeting that just occurred last week in Las Vegas, congratulations on waking up. We're glad you're here with us to hang out. This is going to be a really exciting session, and it'll build on, I'm sure, the conversations you had there. If you weren't part of that meeting, then you're really going to enjoy this because we're talking about something today which is at the forefront of really everything we encounter in our life dealing with commerce and our social lives. But we haven't thought about it a whole heck of a lot in relation to our work in the nonprofit sphere, and it's coming fast. So whether your organization is in the midst of adopting some form of artificial intelligence in terms of tools or techniques, or even just strategy building, or you're kind of putting it off because it's terrifying, you're in the right place. We're going to be talking about that and more today. So once again, welcome. We really are happy to have you. And this session, by the way, this is not to get you to go away. Please stick around. You can talk with us today, but it will be recorded. So if you have colleagues who would benefit from being a part of this dialogue, this will be recorded and put under the DonorSearch YouTube channel content, as well as on the DonorSearch site. If you haven't been there to either of those places, I encourage you to look at that later. Once again, this is the Philanthropy Mastermind series brought to you by DonorSearch. That's the last you'll hear about DonorSearch today. We are so grateful to them for providing a platform where we can have great leaders in the field like the two that you have today, talking with us about subjects which are really important and close to our hearts, and where you can interact with them utilizing the chat or the Q&A today. I want to encourage you to utilize the chat to just tell us you're here. And in fact, if you do that while I'm jabbering, we'd really appreciate that. Just go ahead and say who you are, where you're from. We would love to have that be a part of the thinking of our guests as they address the topic today. And then later, if you have a question that occurs to you throughout, go ahead and put that in Q&A. That's a perfect place for us to then pull those out and make those a part of the conversation later. So again, chat's great for now, Q&A for later. And with that, I want to introduce our guests to you. So happy to have them. Meena Das, who is here to talk with us, of course, out from beautiful BC. She's a nonprofit analytics consultant with her own practice, which is Namaste Data. And I want to mention just a couple of things from each of their bios. One thing is that she has a newsletter called Data Uncollected, and I'm sure she'll share a link to that later, perhaps through the chat, so you can subscribe or check that out. She's also publishing her first ebook, which is Some Data Posts, a collection of essays on the intersection of inclusive research and personal identity, which is pretty damn important these days, and starting her virtual school for nonprofits, Data is for Everyone. So you can check all that out. And again, we'll provide links so you can learn about these folks more after the session today. And Cherian Koshy. Cherian is a CFRE. He's a charter advisor in philanthropy and an AFP master trainer. So that's why I made references to AFP, because if you were there, you either saw him or heard about him there. Cherian's kind of a major fixture in our space in the best sense of that word, that he is speaking with us on a lot of different forms about issues that relate to some of the greatest thinking in the sector. You can learn more about him over at Endowment Partners, where he is a consultant and principal, which is an investment management firm focusing on nonprofits and foundations. But he's been working in the sector for more than 20 years, and you may know him from his previous roles, but I won't get into that. He may even reference them later. Of course, the subject today is the ethics of artificial intelligence and fundraising, and we're going to be doing a deep dive into that right now. And so with that, I want to do a proper welcome to Cherian and Meena. Hi, thanks so much for hanging out today.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
And now I don't know who has said that they're here, but it looks like a few people have been saying hello.
And lots of friends. Good to see so many friends in the audience as well. So that means they won't throw tomatoes.
Hopefully not. And if they do, it's virtual, so it won't hurt.
Right.
But that doesn't mean your comments won't. So do be nice, but do be tough on the ideas. This is a big one. And you two introduced this concept, and you start with the simplest thing, which is really important, I think, which is definitional. So can you talk to us just first about what is AI? I know that sounds really simple, but if we don't define terms in this field, we don't get anywhere. What is artificial intelligence?
Meena, you want to jump in there?
Sure, I will. Jay, I love that question because I would say from my past jobs, I've seen a way that term is defined, and now these days to my consulting, I'm talking about the fundamentals. So how you answer that question depends on who is answering that question, who is being asked that question. So in terms of an analyst, who I am at the core, I would say AI is a piece of technology, basically simply is saying that it's helping you to find out sense of your data, to find out how do you want to do anything with it in terms of its predictions. You can use it in several places. I'm sure we are going to talk about some examples, but I would say AI is like that big ecosystem, a bubble within which you hear the words like data science, like machine learning, the things to do with statistics, that all components talk to each other to bring something beautiful through which you predict stuff. That's AI for you.
And maybe you referenced a couple of other terms that all get thrown around together, or sometimes like a tossed salad. Can you help to differentiate between something like AI and machine learning? I don't know if you want to take that, or Cherian.
I would add one thing, and then I would let Cherian be more articulate and say that in a much more nicer way. One thing that I use, and I would see that it's a little convoluted when you use the words AI and machine learning and data science and predictive modeling. There are a lot of different words there, but I look at these terms as what is the end outcome of this product. Most of the times it ends up being in front of you looking like something like, hey, here's a segmented list. Take a step back, that's AI for you. It's using algorithms of machine learning for you. So what I would say is they're kind of not the same sides of a coin, but they do interact with each other to come under the big same ecosystem. Cherian, I'll pass it on to you.
Yeah, so I just to amplify what you said, Meena, I think we've got to distinguish between sort of narrow AI and more general AI, and then what that looks like for applications in nonprofit. So you probably have seen or heard of narrow AI, meaning that the algorithm or the product can do one specific thing. And honestly, it's really hard to avoid that in our daily lives. If you open up Gmail, there's an AI component to auto completing, or your phone, right? So if you're asking Google or Siri a question, there's an AI component to that. But those artificial intelligences don't have the same capacity or the breadth of human experience. So there are things like payroll or predictive tasks, like filling in Gmail or email text that can be done. There are some cognitive tasks that can be done, and then kind of the emerging space is sort of social tasks, like having conversations with a donor, for example, through a chat bot. They have a question about something, and you can kind of map that. So there are some versions of that where it's just an if then, right? If Jay says, I need tickets to Hamilton, that the chatbot is designed to say, we have Hamilton tickets on these days at these times. Which one would you like, Jay? And it is able to manage that. Where it goes
so does that mean we're teaching AI to lie, because there are no Hamilton tickets?
Come to Des Moines. You can have I'm going to Hamilton in a week, so you can come with. But for nonprofits, and then Emma is in Las Vegas. I bet you if you want to go back to Las Vegas, she can help with that. So when it comes to nonprofits, the real selling point is that it creates capacity at lower costs. So we could identify potential donor prospects. We could identify upgrade opportunities. We could build fundraising campaigns. That's a space that I'm super focused on in AI and machine learning. You could monitor sentiment, right? You could see what people are saying out there on the blogosphere or on social media about your nonprofit. And like I said, even conduct donor customer service, if you will, through AI. So I think there's a lot of opportunity, but that opportunity, to kind of boil that down, anytime a decision is being made, ethics come into play. And if artificial intelligence is human-like decision-making, then that decision-making opens up the space for ethics.
I know we have a definitional question, so maybe we should hit that about what is the bot and how are they controlled and managed? I don't know if we'll get into that more later, but it's good to at least define it now.
That's a good transition into kind of what the risk is, right? So the example that you may have heard of is maybe 5 or 6 years ago, Microsoft introduced a Twitter bot called Tay, and Tay was supposed to imitate like a teenage girl or something like that, and it pulled information from Twitter to be able to create the tweets. And what they found is, and you probably have seen this if you're on Twitter, there are so many trolls that Tay, the Twitter bot, became this racist, misogynistic, spewing, robot, which was terrible. And so Microsoft quickly shut it down. So these robots are ways, and there are simple ones, right? There are Twitter bots that you can create that if it sees the word AI ethics, which there was one that happened today and retweeted a post that I had about this webinar. And there, you could do that for your nonprofit or something like that if you chose to do so. But what Meena was saying about the machine learning, when they start learning on their own, that input of data is what gets, in this case, really, really bad. If you're searching for this, I think it was like the internet turns a computer into a Nazi. That was the title of the article on NPR, something like that.
Yeah.
It was bad news.
Cherian, what you just said gave me a new way to define to the first question we had. Any system that is constantly learning about you and then intending to make your life better, that is what the proposed definition of AI is. The problem is how it is learning about you and then what it is going to do about it. There are issues, and that's where the question of ethics come.
There are so many questions about that because it depends upon who's in the audience, but for many organizations, their interaction is going to be largely the kinds of things that you've just been talking about, that bot on Twitter, or the chat bot is the greatest example because we all interact with them so frequently, sometimes not even aware whether or not they are machines or bots or humans, although I guess increasingly there's a perception that those things must be bots. But is the purpose behind all that, first of all, is the purpose just efficiency, or is it to make essentially better interactions, better humans through bots? Why are we using these things in the first place? Is it just for efficiency, or is there something more at play?
I'll jump in saying that the chatbot thing is, I would say my guess would be efficiency, that these, we are at a place where when we want to scale, we are living in a world where when we want to scale, the first thing that comes to our mind is we want to grow and become efficient and become effective. These are the words that pop up. And AI-based tools and technologies help in that. Chatbot is an example of it. And I want to offer a personal example of how this technology sometimes lacks. So I have a profile with PayPal. All of us do, most of us do. I also have a profile with Coinbase to do some minimal transactions. And I have had experiences in both of those technologies when I have to multiple times, I don't know how many times you have to verify yourself on those platforms, but I have to verify, I would say 5 times at least in a month. And that has been my experience in the last 7-8 months. Growing up, there would be some form of a product that would be self-guided product, on your video, show yourself, talk to the camera, read something to it, and tell me that you are an actual person. I have done that, and never have I succeeded so far in saying that I'm an actual person. I have to wait, email people, find people who can look at my passport and say that, yeah, you are a person and you are safe to do transactions on Coinbase and on PayPal and send money, get money, that sort of thing. That is one of the issues in that product, is it is not able to understand, and based on, even after reading to it something from my page or a book, that, hey, this is a normal human being. That's one example where the technology lacks in not being inclusive enough. Cherian, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. We use chatbots all the time in our normal kind of day-to-day life because they're all over websites. But I think when it comes to nonprofits, the application of AI has a lot to do with efficiency. I mentioned on a panel at AFP that we lost 1 million jobs in the nonprofit sector during the pandemic, and we've only recovered 500,000. So lots of nonprofits are trying to figure out how do we continue to scale with fewer people. And I'll just say out loud what I said in the session, that we need to pay our people for doing more work than what they have done in the past. But organizations are trying to figure that out. So what does that mean for posting on social media, or writing blog posts, or doing donor care at a scalable way, right? There's only so many humans that can answer the phone or respond to emails or fill in the blank, right? So what are the ways in which we can scale those operations without scaling the human power? But I think a lot of it the intention is doing better, right? To your point, Jay, of having a better experience, because it arguably eliminates some form of bias, right? The assumption, and we'll get into this more, the assumption is that data is neutral, and as a result, we can do a better job by our organizations, or by our donors, or by community at large, but we've eliminated the bad human elements.
And I know that's something that you both can talk about a lot. I'm not sure if you want to jump into that later or now about bias, but I do know you already alluded to some of the risks, and you talked about that a little bit. Maybe we can dive into that further. I just thought it was going to be helpful not only to have a definition, but an example. Chatbots are an easy one that we recognize. What are some of the risks, and where do they present themselves? In the same way that, a chatbot, you just showed how it can be pretty helpful and efficient, but it also can sometimes be very inhuman, or the uncanny valley thing, which I know we can talk about later. So what are the real risks of employing AI, and what are some of those that nonprofits might encounter right now with the tools available?
Cherian, I'll let you go first.
Okay, so let me just kind of continue that thread and kind of move away from bots into sort of predictive analytics around who our donors could be. Obviously, there's one element of inside of our donor file doing, having algorithms to identify if we have non-donors in the file, how many or who would be the best to prospect towards in order to get them to donate, and then those people that have donated to get them to upgrade. The challenge, and then outside of your organization, who are the best kind of new prospects. So from a high level, the thing that folks need to be concerned about, need to be aware of, is that facially neutral data, meaning information that doesn't seem to have a bias, can serve as a proxy to inadvertently introduce discrimination, particularly when it's related to race, religion, sexual preference, like all of these things that are protected that we would never use as a characteristic. So hopefully if you're on this webinar, you understand the massive amounts of data that's available on each one of you out there in the public, right? The information that's accessible, particularly through like credit card companies, is downright frightening. Like, we can tell what types of magazines you read, and what you spend money on in the grocery store, and the things that you like on social media and whatnot. And as a result of that, we can sort of triangulate your preferences. The quintessential example of this is a father receives a mailer from Target that says, hey, you're preparing for a new baby in the house, here are some coupons. And what the father did not realize, the father got mad at Target and was like, my daughter's not pregnant. Turns out she was, and she had looked for baby material, and so Target knew before the dad did.
Yeah.
So these kind of facially neutral pieces of information, your search history, all these types of things, could be used to introduce bias, and we have to be kind of mindful of that. And my concern is that it could create philanthropic exclusion, right? It could create a precedent to not include someone in philanthropy that should be included in philanthropy because of that facially neutral data.
Wow, that's such an interesting concept of philanthropic exclusion. And it's not like we haven't been doing it already, but now we're adding huge horsepower to the problem.
Right.
Meena, do you have thoughts on that?
I was gonna, agree to all of that, and I would give an example. I keep thinking about it as I write in my newsletters, and one of the examples that I feel like is, and it's not related to nonprofits. Let's assume, you live in a hostel with 4 friends, let's say, and on January 1st, you have to decide what you would be eating for the rest of the year. So you'll get groceries, and now let's say you use that to give it to your person who gets the groceries, and that's the only thing that you are going to get for the rest of the year. So those are the only combinations you are getting. For the rest of the year, your hostel can have more people who have different dietary restrictions. They come with different backgrounds, but you are not able to, because of the way your systems are set up, let's say, you are not able to update your needs there. All you are getting is a list every week. This is the food that you're going to eat. These are the foods that is going to be in the kitchen. You're getting it every week, again and again, again and again. That's the kind of a problem I have with the systems that we have right now. The systems we have right now starts from, you define a problem, right? That's we define when we need AI. Then you get the data, you collect the data that you have. Then we run it through some algorithms. Then we create some output, and then we set it into production or set it into automation so that it can repeatedly give you answers. Every step of that chain has its own issues that comes with biases, that comes with problems. What problems are you defining? How are you defining it? The data that was collected over the years, does it have issues? Yes, it does. What are we doing about it? The algorithms we are running it through, to the point where we are creating output, outcomes, and what narratives are we using to explain that output? To whom are we explaining that output? Is it something extractive that we are doing, hearing from people coming from marginalized population and then using it to build products and going back to sell it to them? That's the issue of that whole chain and that's my issue. And what's at risk here, I like to call it something like, I don't want to be deleted from the data. I don't want to be removed from the way philanthropy is seen, because I see it too. I have a definition of philanthropy. I want it to be considered. I want it to be heard, acknowledged, seen, just as much as any other definition is.
Mm-hmm. Wow, this is fascinating on so many levels, because let's say it's traditional segmentation versus the things we're talking about now using machine learning. I know that in the past, maybe this is an apocryphal story, but that Victoria's Secret catalog, for example, when people used to buy from that company, I know it's still out there, but anyway, that they would market that catalog to specific populations. And I believe that the Latina population, for example, was not high on that priority list, is my understanding. And so then nonprofits would rent lists, of course, in order to do donor acquisition. One of those lists that they might rent would be the Victoria's Secret catalog. Those were people who had a certain demographic and, in terms of their economic spending power, et cetera, et cetera. But that means that there was an element of exclusion that maybe the nonprofits weren't even aware of when they were doing it. They were looking for women who might give. There were women who buy whatever they were buying at Victoria's Secret. But because Victoria's Secret was, again, in this story, was not marketing to the Latinx population, therefore, those women would not be among the people the nonprofits would invite to participate as volunteers or as donors. Do we have that same kind of problem within this realm of AI, or does the profusion of data help or hurt? How does that work out?
If I can add, just because there's a really clear example in the sector, which is for decades we've been using RFM analysis, right? But if historically people of color, particularly in the US, people, I'm sure this is true in Canada as well, but people of color have not been involved in philanthropy. I have worked in a number of predominantly white institutions where the data file is all white people for the most part. So if you do RFM analysis on that data set, and then you supercharge it now with AI, that result, the initial data, does not help the bias, it accentuates the bias. I made the statement at one point, for a specific example, that the RFM analysis actually reifies the racism. It tells you, or it could tell you, if you're not thinking well, that you should only be looking for white donors. If you're looking for mirror donors from your RFM profile, it's the people who go to the country club and have this kind of discretionary spend and subscribe to Victoria's Secret. So those are the lists that you should read. Those are the places where you should go. So nonprofits have been doing this for quite a while.
Right.
I think the answer to your question, Jay, is that it could be good, it could be bad. If we're not thoughtful at this level early on to say, we're aware of the biases that our data has, so we're going to make sure that when algorithms or results indicate something that doesn't make sense, that we're mindful of that and saying, nope, stop, this is not right.
Right.
Conversely, if we have better data coming into the system, I think it does create opportunity to identify new opportunities to create philanthropic inclusion.
I would add to what Cherian you just said. I mean, I agree with that, and I would add, along with that RFM thing that you just mentioned, and I think Cherian, I think you and I talked about it in our conversation too, is when we have been historically so, I would say, driven by this behavior to collect good data, which can lead to good RFM analysis. So we have good information on recency, frequency, monetary data sets, data points, that I feel like we may have missed a chance to collect some other data points that should have been collected, that should have become part along the way, but it just didn't. I think that is where my name, the data uncollected, comes from. Right? Like, I want us to really think about what data we missed to collect that could have been part of this whole thing, this ecosystem, to say, okay, now we can make more sense of it. When I feel like when we say ethics of AI, I don't really feel it's the fault of the machine itself. It's our thing that we are doing with it. It's not the problem with the algorithm. What are we doing with it? That's the question.
Absolutely right. 100%.
So many thoughts come to mind as you talk about this. Yes, but we're not talking about the rise of the machines here. We're definitely talking about the rise of maybe certain humans and how they use these tools in order to achieve certain results. Sometimes committing omission, sins of omission, and sometimes of commission. And there's a very big difference. Leaving something out because you haven't thought about it versus leaving something out because you're trying to engender a certain result. Let's say, I want more gifts for my capital campaign, so I better look at people who just gave gifts like that last time. And I know we could spend a whole hour on just that subject alone. But I know that this is only one of the many risks here that you've talked about. There's this harm to maybe philanthropy as a whole, and I don't know if you feel that that's been sufficiently addressed. Where money is coming from and where is it going? As people use AI tools, they're getting them predominantly from vendors, right? And the vendors are serving the need that people want to purchase. I mean, unless somebody has a statistician and a person familiar with building these things internally, they're getting it from somewhere. And at least in my experience, people would often buy what is being sold, but it also means that they're selling something because they know people will buy it. So I wonder how much influence do we have as nonprofits over what tools are available to us, and how can we ensure that those tools are a better reflection of the kind of donor population that we want to see, not just the ones that are in our RFM analysis, but all those people who might potentially love the same things we love and want to support the same things that we care about.
Jim, you wanna? Yeah, go ahead.
So that's a really hard question to answer for a lot of reasons. I think what I would say is, first of all, we need to be mindful of the responsibility of service providers, of vendors, and a high standard needs to be placed on them, especially in the absence of a regulatory framework. So this is not an area that is very clearly legislated. The nonprofit sector does not have a normative framework for ethics, which we'll talk about more later, I'm sure. But we don't have the tools or the vocabulary. I'm on the board of AFP. We don't have anything in the code that talks about, AI or a wide variety of other things. So this is a very nascent field for ethics. So Beth Cantor and Allison Fine have this great book, and they have a treatment around ethics. And this 1 hour is like this huge expansion into into that space, that is just the beginning of this conversation that needs to go way further. I think the key that we need to be mindful of is that at its core, philanthropy is about human interaction. And so we lose that when we turn over the keys to the robots, right? And Stephen Shattuck wrote this really good book called Robots Make Bad Fundraisers. He's right. Even as and I should just acknowledge, like, I am not a Luddite. I'm not at all opposed to AI. During the pandemic, I started figuring out code to build a GPT OpenAI framework for nonprofits to use that I'm still working on. So I'm not opposed to any of this. I think what Meena said is really important. But we have to balance that human connection and human oversight against our philanthropic goals. So vendors who talk about raising X amount of dollars need to temper that expectation with the human oversight that needs to go into the process of raising funds.
Yeah, I would agree to that, and I would add 2 points. One is, as someone who has been in other nonprofits as analyst or looking at teams there, and now as a social entrepreneur, I would say, one, if we are trying to build any kind of awareness around AI, that has to be from top to bottom. It cannot be just your analyst. It cannot be just about your prospect research team. It cannot be just about your analytics team. It has to be, that level of awareness needs to be a continuous learning thing with your fundraisers, with your leadership. This is a collective, consciously picked responsibility, not of one person. And second, I would say, something that I was writing in my recent issue of Data Uncollected was about algorithmic behaviors. And I feel like one of the things that I was thinking about is, when you are working with vendors, and when I say I mean like nonprofit. So I'm a nonprofit, let's say, and I'm working with Cherian, let's say he's a vendor. That relationship cannot be the only two people relationship. That has to be a co-designed space with someone from the community in that interaction. So he as well learns what he needs to implement in his technology, while I also learn both from community and my vendor what needs to go into that solution. That power has to be distributed. It cannot be just with me as someone who's paying, or with my vendor company who is providing me solution. That has to be distributed, and hopefully be more where it really belongs, with the community, not with the one who's paying or where the money is necessarily.
Wow, that's we almost have to then start issuing sledgehammers with tools, because breaking down all these walls that already existed before AI, I mean, it's going to be really hard now. In fact, one thing you just mentioned, like when you're talking about the silos within the organization, is this prospect research area, where the old joke in fundraising was that people in prospect research were in a different zip code from the rest of the office in higher ed. Sometimes that's still true. Yeah. But what the conversation in the last couple of years within the world of APRA, our kind of a sister organization of AFP, has been about how we make sure that and they aren't using this language, but allow people to self-identify, allow them to represent themselves in the data. So in the past, we would have been very careful to include information which had to do with, let's say, ethnicity or gender. Today, there's an effort, of course, to put those things in the database so that we can respect people's identity as they define it. That's a very positive thing in our current cultural context. But it does mean that we are going to have to look at the ethics, of course, of, do we take this data and put it in a database that may not always be seen the same way? Are we going to see these definitions and these words the same way in 20 years that we do today? Because those people will still be living as our donors 20 years from today.
I would say what you just mentioned two things coming to my mind. One is, yes, we want to collect that ethnicity data or the diversity data or the data, social identity data, right, into our database. And the second question is, do we want it into our modeling systems? Do we want it into our AI systems? Most often, the ethics says we don't want it. We don't want things of social identity per se into our algorithms that can add to the biases of the data that's already biased. And I want to offer an example here without taking any names from one of the recent workshops I conducted, was this theater organization, this grant making team came up with this question that, hey, I have this algorithm in-house that I use to segment these artists and the projects that need funding and send it to my funders. And we do include the social identity data. The problem is now I am seeing a couple of new identities in my artists and I don't know how to score them for my funders. There was a lot of big red flags questions there.
Oh, yeah.
Where is it coming from? Who's asking for that question? Why are you doing it? How can you stop doing that? But the only thing that we could tackle at that point of moment was, how are you asking about social identity data? Are those 5 checkboxes you have seen wandering around in Google, that the first link that comes up, here are the way you should ask your survey social identity questions? Because sometimes what happens is the way those checkboxes are created, they are not inclusive. If you are asking, it depends on the context. I wouldn't say they're always wrong, but it depends on the context. So if you are, I, as a South Asian woman, would want to be asked at one point in a certain context as my own checkbox versus part of the Asian bucket, versus there might be contexts where it would be better to just ask a question, please self-describe it however you wish to share about your identity. It really depends on how you are asking the question, and that affects our, like I said, objective setting, the way we do analysis, the way we create narratives from it. But yeah, I wanted to offer that example here when we were talking about that ethnic data.
That's brilliant. And Cherian, what are you in agreement that collecting that data can be useful, but importing it into the models can be problematic? Because
I think it has so much to do with how the model plays out. And this is where nonprofits in particular need to be hyper vigilant about not just the data, but understanding how the algorithm is thinking about the data that it's incorporating and learning from that to be able to come up with decisions. So I work for an investment firm that's owned by women, which makes it one of fewer than 2% of investment firms out there. And so being in that fintech space where financial data is there's a plethora of financial data. One of the things that we realize is the reverse of what Meena said is really important to recognize that nonprofits can learn from, which is over the next decade, by 2030, $11 trillion in household assets will pass from men to women, from boomer men to boomer women in that generation. So McKinsey was looking at this data and realizing that all wealth management data is associated with men, and all marketing in the future has to be focused on women. Now, I'm not trying to make a binary distinction between men and women. The McKinsey data just parsed it that way. So I want to recognize what Meena said, like, these folks need to be able to self-identify whether there's another a gender or sex component that they want to self-identify there. But that data set indicates what's massively missing in what's out there right now. So we have to be super mindful of what the algorithms are not including in order to understand why the outputs might lead us astray, honestly. And that's what's happening in financial services right now.
You've talked about some of the risks, and I have a feeling you've just scratched the surface, which is why we need to keep talking about this.
Yeah.
I mean, that's why AFP hasn't really totally figured it out yet, and AFP is working very seriously on it. That's not a dig. Same thing is happening over in APRA world, where that's all they do is deal with research and prospect development, but they haven't figured this out either. That's why they're working on it. So we have to keep having this discussion. But aside from the risks, there are clearly opportunities, and I want to ask you what those might look like. And if you don't mind, a leading question, Meena, when you were talking about some of this a few minutes ago, you talked about making sure that, let's say, the vendors and the nonprofits, or maybe even just certain people within a nonprofit, aren't defining all these things about what data to use and how to interpret it, but also that there might be a community voice that we need to have in there. So maybe that's one of the opportunities, but I'm not sure how we effectuate that, how we make that possible, who those community members are, if they are truly representative of all the communities. So Meena, can you take a swipe at that about how among the many opportunities we can take that?
No, I will. And I do want to probably I should have said that at the beginning of the call. Now that I'm doing it by myself as a social entrepreneur, by no means I want to say that this is all the end all final all things, that this is very evolving conversation. I'm learning. In fact, I feel like I'm less noun, more verbs now. So I'm always sort of good struggling. But what I have learned so far in thinking about this work is we can't have a representation of the community at the end of a decision saying, hey, a document is created, and now you take a look and add some comments if you feel like it. I'm giving an example. Let's say you, again, I'm a nonprofit. Let's say Cherian is my vendor who is offering me an AI solution or a solution, and we both talked about a product. We defined a solution for our nonprofit. We created a document, and then we send out to 3 to 5 folks from the community out who would be at the end result of my operations in the nonprofit. That is not so helpful to say that's how the community is involved, because we have already taken the important decisions, because I have exercised my power in deciding how that product would be used, how that product would be designed, and what my fundraisers are going to do with that product. The community involvement happens when the power is rightfully placed at the right time with those folks. So I want my community members to be involved with me when I'm talking to Cherian about that product, about that solution, that, hey, okay, I'm going to make a product like this. It's going to benefit you so in a so and so way. How can we make that happen? To give a more concrete example would be, I have a friend in Seattle, and she and I have been talking about around refugee, immigrant, and refugee rights. And one of the things that happens in the immigrant world is the domestic violence, and the people who suffer from that, especially the women, they do not prefer to share their contact information, their home addresses, or leave such information, obviously from your point of view of safety, security, kind of a thing. And when you are building a model, or you are creating a system for a nonprofit like that, you want voices from the community to say, what are the data points that are being used in the model there. So going back to the question of ethnicity and race, yes, it is important in that particular cause, because we want to see our marginalized population getting the help they need. But in that case, a way of analysis, for example, would be not to include every data point in your predictive model, but create a model with a subset of the data points and then use it at the latter end of it when you are creating narratives. So instead of using all data points at the same time, that is going to create again and again an automated results every month, I'll create a subset of a model and then use it on a one-off basis with the race data, with ethnicity data. So I'm not using it to create my AI system. So the thing that can be changed, that can be talked about, is how are we analyzing this information depending on the mission, depending on, going back to that community member's voice. Like I can have a community member in that situation to say, okay, what are the data points, that subset data points I'm talking about for the AI model? Which ones should that be? And I should not be the only one who makes those decisions. So say this, and this data point is important. Not because I feel like my community members wouldn't know what they need. They know what they need. They have a voice. All I need to do is bring them on board and share that power from the start, instead of at the end and say, hey, can you write some comments at the end? Does this make sense to you?
Wow. It almost makes me wonder if maybe one of the things that consultants, leaders at nonprofits, and vendors can do is say, one of the things that you need to do, just like you need to provide an address to do a screening, or you need to have a list in order to do a capital campaign. One of the things you need to do is, or you're going to need to bring in some community participation that truly reflects the community that you serve, as a kind of a counterweight to whatever definitions you're developing for the use of AI. But maybe I'm wrong about that. Cherian, what are your thoughts on this and other opportunities?
So I think checks and balances are important. There are several Silicon Valley companies that are in this space that have impaneled like ethics advisory boards, which are a good idea, but also kind of clunky. All of this sort of speaks to the issue of transparency, right? So when I started getting curious about OpenAI and GPT-3 and all of these other things, one of the things that that I found was this movement called Code in Public, right? And the idea around AI is the problem, the potential problem, I should say, is developing algorithms in a black box where we don't know why certain things were weighted the way they were, and how do those weights and measures, especially when kind of left to their own devices in the machine learning component, alter results in a significant way, and do those match our values as the sector, as our organization, as a fundraiser, all of those things. So I think there has to be, like, internally for vendors, and some nonprofits have AI people on staff. I know some hospitals do. So I guess predominantly vendors, though. The key is to make sure that at the algorithm design stage, that there's oversight to ensure that the algorithm is prepared in a way that makes sense, and that there's some level of transparency. Obviously, they're for-profit companies, so they need to, like, have something close to the vest. But is there a way to enable transparency in some factor, like a ethics advisory board that doesn't share the algorithm but does provide input on some opportunities or some challenges there? And then I think the other piece is really for nonprofits to feel comfortable speaking up about challenges that they see and being well versed in ethics enough, sufficiently so to say, these are some concerns that I'm seeing, and this is how we're going to hold, just like we would hold Facebook accountable for its use of the algorithm on what to display and what not to display with, Cambridge Analytica or whatever. We need to hold other organizations accountable for what they're doing with their algorithm. I don't know exactly what that looks like, so we're not going to cover that today, but I do think that there's a responsibility for us to be aware enough to say, hey, I have a question.
I would add an example. You just mentioned how that would look like. An example is coming to my mind. Do you both, either of you know, a couple of years ago, Facebook had this, and I don't remember the exact wiki page title that was into it, but Facebook had this thing where if you need to create your profile, you need your first name and last name, and it could not recognize any first names that were indigenous names. It couldn't, with any of those, it only had to be those non-indigenous names to be like a valid name. So it was outright saying it's an invalid name, you can't create a profile. There was a huge uproar. How can this happen? And I think they changed it after getting a lot of back and forth, but not an easy thing. But an ethics advisory is needed because social identity is a complex thing. It's not one identity, 5 constraints, 2 conditions, simple checkbox kind of a thing.
Right.
It's a complex thing. It's people's identities. We need to have open mind and flexibility.
As you're talking about this, it occurs to me that, and I know we're going to talk a little bit about whether we need to develop ethical codes for an organization to utilize, but then for an industry to utilize, but then there's this broader, ocean of all the companies that we live and work with every day, sometimes not even thinking that we're doing it, just like with Facebook. And I wonder how we can even gain enough awareness of what we're touching in order to have an influence over it. I mean, they should be answerable to us as customers, but in fact, in each of the social media platforms, we are the product. We aren't really the customer at all. Right. So I'm curious about, when you think about the different risks that you've been outlining, and then you think about obviously the opportunity, which I'm hearing is not only creating efficiency and the ability to show some care to donors, to be able to talk to them maybe on a more regular basis in a way that's attuned to what they are expressing that they need, and et cetera. All those things that we know, that if we can eliminate some of the biases, that's another potential benefit if we do that right with community involvement. Those are the things I'm hearing from you. What I don't know is what's the governing structure for those things. How do we develop those things for our organizations, for our field, and then for the broader community where we all live and work?
Throw that out with 10 minutes left.
Yeah, sorry.
So here's what I'll say. I guess the concern that I would raise is that we are an unregulated sector, right? We don't have, anybody can be a fundraiser. Like I can raise funds for my kids' PTO without any kind of oversight. Nothing that AFP or CFRE or whatever says can make a difference, right? I can do whatever I want. So I think those of us that are in the sector and in the sector for the purpose of advancing the sector have to be more. So there's this thing out there on the web, this ESH, everyone sucks here, which is true in the social media space. What I do when I talk about ethics to like AFP chapters and stuff is to say everyone's responsible here. So vendors are responsible, organizations are responsible, individuals are responsible. If you are buying technology, you need to be responsible. You need to at least understand, and maybe you've checked that box by coming here, but you need to understand that there are ethical implications to every tool that you buy. And if you're going to use this to raise money, whether it's an email program or some AI tool, you need to understand what are the implications. I don't foresee any sort of regulatory framework. I don't think that will ever happen. I don't think that I shouldn't say ever, but I think there is opportunity for us to collectively and communally shape values that reflect best practices when it comes to some of these things. And those are the discussions that we should have, but I think the important piece, and I know there's a question in the chat from Taryn that I want to address here around DAOs. The lovely thing about DAOs is that there is a clear ownership chain of the dollars that are being transacted. What I am particularly worried about, none of the nonprofits on this call, of course, or anybody listening is an untoward nonprofit, but nonprofits do exert power in the space that in civic society. So we need to be mindful of how dollars are flowing into nonprofits and where those dollars are coming from and what they're being poured into and why. So I'm not a huge fan of vast amounts of anonymous dollars flowing in and through nonprofits. I think that's a dangerous. I understand why. I will die on the hill of donor privacy for some things, but I think there is a whole lot of risk around just blanket stating anonymous giving, donor privacy, all of those things. So I think at the very least, even if we don't disclose that information, there has to be more checks and balances around that as well. And that's a bit of a rabbit trail on DAOs and NFTs and whatnot. But I think we've got to be, as organizations, the two questions I would ask when you're presented with an ethical dilemma is, what does this prohibit and what does this permit? What does this prohibit and what does this permit? Because if you say, I will never accept a gift of a donor that has a felony conviction, who does that exclude and why does it exclude them? I did this on a podcast before and people are saying, well, we would never accept gifts from a felon. I'm like, well, historically, certain things were felony offenses and they adversely affected certain populations. So you're excluding a lot of, in particular, Black men from philanthropy if you play that card. I think that's a bad idea, including some of my friends who are in philanthropy and fundraising. So let's be thoughtful of whether that's the right hard line to draw or if there's more nuance there. And I think that's the bottom line. There's always nuance. That's all I got.
No, that's a lot. Mm-hmm.
I love that. And I want to extend that thought and say, like, the simplest and the easiest thing I can start, and that's what I'm doing. And I want, like, Cherian is what he mentioned. I just want to extend that thought, saying it just ties back to how do you think about equity, inclusion, diversity topics. This is not a special additional lens. This ethics is not a new topic. It has to be part of the DNA of every single thing. My job, my personal life, my conversations, how I'm showing up. This cannot be a new topic to say, how am I thinking about ethics of, why just AI, the gifts policies that we were talking about. So if we keep thinking on those things and have better clarity and make it part of the DNA, I think ethics of AI would be taken care of in some shapes or forms.
That's so interesting because we have an ethics month, within AFP world, and that's a great thing. But ethics don't stop and begin at October 1st and end at October 31st, just like Black History Month is a good thing. I mean, but Black history doesn't begin and end in 1 month. And it's all these things are sort of like that. I know we need to bring attention to it, but we don't get a get out of jail free card, to borrow from your reference to people in felony convictions, just because we talked about it for a few weeks. That these things are incumbent upon us to think about all the time, even if they aren't particularly fun. And but it sounds like we still have a lot of thinking to do towards the future about how to implement these things. So I want to ask you maybe the toughest question of all, which is, as everybody together is collectively learning and trying to do the right thing, and I don't mean just hold the letter of the law, since there aren't many of them, but rather to be better at what we do, to be more inclusive, not because people are telling us to, but because that makes it for better organizations. That how do we keep talking about that? Where are the places that you two look for some guidance, for the newest kind of ethical, if not codes, kind of guidance for where the thinkers are and where people are getting together? Who are the helpers, as Mr. Rogers would say, that you look to as you're thinking about these issues?
Meena, you want to start?
Sure. I would say I like to refer to the library. That's a beautiful building next to my home. I would go there, sit there, look at the books there. And I have found a lot of good books, one of which is Design Justice. I keep talking about it every time someone asks me this question. That book is so beautiful that I cannot read more than 10 pages a night. I have to pause and leave it at that for 2 nights. I cannot read it continuously, though I love to read, because it offers so much. It's like a power packed smoothie. But that's one thing where we can read books. The other places where I do like to go and get some inspiration is joining some of those local groups. For me, it has worked. Local groups around LGBTQ, around different immigration rights. That's some of my interest areas. Just trying to be in spaces that does not look like me, so I can listen and observe and understand what they have gone through. I don't want someone to sit in front of me and give me their time to explain their lived experiences. I want to be part of those spaces where they're already sharing it and I can hear and understand what is going on. So I can take it back and think on it and reflect on it to realize what we missed collectively as humans out of that conversation.
It's beautiful, beautiful thought. Cherian?
So I think that there are a lot of helpers inside the sector. As you mentioned, a lot of organizations are working on ethics and having good discussions around this. I think that they're outside the sector, places like medical ethics, business ethics, and ethics in finance are good places to see how other industries are addressing some of the issues that we're all facing, right? Because ethics or AI, certainly ethics, as Meena mentioned, but AI is not just confined to the nonprofit space. We're behind tremendously on the nonprofit sector, is behind on almost all the things, but certainly on AI, we're behind other sectors. So we can learn from what are they dealing with. I mean, I've known Frances Haugen for 20 years. Listening to her and reading her stuff is good stuff in this space, and I think some of her ideas are worth looking at, particularly for the nonprofit sector. But I think while it's true that people don't think of ethics as fun, I do. I'm a weirdo. I do think that I think it's important that every nonprofit person have a base level working knowledge of what ethics are, what are the ethical components. And the thing that I would flip, Jay, on your question is, I don't know that I encourage everyone to get like a fundamental understanding of ethics and kind of work these things out. But where I would flip your question in some respects is to say, we all need to be one another's teacher. So we are the helper. Everybody on this call, everybody who watches, everybody in this sector. we are in a nascent space, an infantile space, particularly for our sector. We are all going to make mistakes. We have to be transparent about our mistakes so that other people can learn. So one of the things my coach, Rory Vaden, says is that you are best positioned to help the person you once were. We're all going to make mistakes in this space. Give people grace. When we know better, we'll do better, and learn from one another's mistakes. That doesn't mean that you're not accountable for mistakes that you made, but let's take that and say, this is a learning opportunity. Let's be public about it. Let's not be ridiculous and say, I never make mistakes and nothing I could ever do as a person, as a fundraiser, as a vendor is ever wrong. Let's put that out there and say, here's where we screwed up. Here's why the algorithm didn't make sense. Here's why we made a decision that didn't reflect our values, so that everyone else in the sector can learn from that, and we can grow the purpose of philanthropy in the sector. That's my sense of this.
Another set of beautiful thoughts. I mean, I'm almost hearing Whitney Houston and George Benson singing about how we have to be the hero of this story. And it's another thought that occurred to me is, I think Nathan Chappelle, who does the AI work over at DonorSearch, he was quoting from a survey, I don't know the source of it, saying that, as you pointed out, Cherian, that we have what in the nonprofit sector, only 23% of nonprofits apparently are touching or somehow engaging with AI versus 97% of corporations. And so we have a long road to go. And if we can look to one another for a little bit of help, as well as spending a little time reading the things that really inspire us to do better, and then we'll all do better. But I know that your words, your thoughts, your insights, your observations are critical, not just for this, but for later. So if you two would each share how people can follow you, learn more about you, maybe if you're willing, get in contact with you. I know that people would appreciate that too. Meena, would you like to share how people can reach out to you or learn more about your work?
Yeah, of course. Thanks, Jay. I have my LinkedIn profile pretty much updated. I take it as literally my apartment door. So knock on my door, I'll welcome you in, and then we can talk there. I have a website and my email address. Jay, you have all links. So is your team or you someone going to send out those links, or I can paste them on the chat?
You can put them right in the chat, and we'll make sure that it's in the recording as well. Yes, thank you. And feel free to just say it so that people can hear it as well. If you want to at least give your URL, something like that.
Of course, it's Namaste Data. It's literally the words Namaste and data together.org. Super simple website made after tons of coffee by myself and learning, looking at the font. And you have my LinkedIn profile too. I have my full name, Meenakshi, in the brackets, Meena Das. That's a name there. You can find me and reach out to me. I'm always open for connections. I keep my Fridays open just to talk to people. So I'm here.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Meena. Cherian?
Almost exactly the same. So I normally make the joke that I'm the one with the unique name, but Meena's here. So you can find me on LinkedIn and Twitter, and feel free to reach out with questions. Website is myname.com, cheriankoshy.com. Feel free to reach out. I also keep Fridays open to talk with folks. So so feel free to do that. Not this Friday though. I've got things, but I do understand that we only scratched the surface here, and that was intentional. So if there are other questions, we'd love to continue this conversation, but feel free to just take this and run with it too, like build your own conversation out of the work that's here.
Right. Yeah. Thank you both so much. Really loved it. And thank you for letting me take us down ridiculous rabbit holes. It was very educational for me, and I hope for some of the other people who are willing to hang out and to listen to each of you. I would love it if we could discuss this again on a regular basis, because we all need to be better informed about this, but we also need to be more confident about doing the right thing in what is increasingly the technological reality of our world. We cannot avoid it anymore. There's no more just going back to recency, frequency, single highest gift. It's dead, guys. This is the new world. So, like it or not. Anyway, thank you all very much for hanging out with us today. We appreciate you, and we hope you'll come back for another session. We have a session coming up next week that I'm sure you'll enjoy with Amy Eisenstein. We also have a great series of podcasts. So if you just like listening to this stuff, you can take a listen to that. All of that is under the Philanthropy Mastermind series. And you know what? If you want to show DonorSearch that you care about these conversations too, pay them a visit, will you? If you do want to know about your donors, including maybe through an AI lens, I won't tell you more than that. You can discover it yourself over at DonorSearch.net. They're a friend to sector. We appreciate them very much, just as we appreciate you. So till next time, take care, stay healthy. We'll see you soon. Bye, guys.